This is the Liberal Europe podcast by ELF, bringing liberal ideas into the political debate, with Leszek Jazdzewski and Riccardo Silvestra.
Hello, this is Leszek Jazdzewski. Welcome to Liberal Europe. Today we are going to talk about the rise of populists and the foreign policy. Very interesting topic. And I have a very special guest today, Teresa Coratella, who is the deputy head of the Rome office of the European Council of Foreign Relations, and co-author of the report, Rise to the Challenges, Europe's Populist Parties and its Foreign Policy Future. Teresa, welcome to Liberal Europe.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So you have a very interesting beginning of your report when you sort of analyze the imaginary picture from the G8 in 2029. Putin is invited back by J.D. Vance, who is a US president. Jordan Bardella is a French president. And quite unexpectedly, I might say, Giorgia Meloni is the EU Council president. And only Merz and von der Leyen remain from the current EU establishment. I wanted to start with asking you, how likely do you think is such a scenario and what it would mean for the EU as a whole?
Well, this is a very first interesting question, as well, quite difficult to answer. Our scenario is a kind of dystopic at the moment, if we look at the current European politics. However, at the same time, we thought about this scenario, trying to anticipate somehow Trump's presidency effects on European politics and how this might somehow influence in the future member states as well as the overall institutional framework. So, for example, you see in this scenario a return of Putin. We have been seeing in recent months how President Trump has been advocating at the beginning for this return. However, now his mind appears to be changed. However, if you look at some of the parties we have analyzed in our project, we see how some of them, I would say many of them, claim and ask for Russia to be re-engaged again in a diplomatic dialogue in relations with Europe. So to have Russia back as a key player, not only a political player, but also an economic one. For example, yesterday in the Italian parliament, we have been discussing after the Five-Star Movement made an official proposal on how to start buying again Russian gas, like we used to do before the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine. So although this G8 scenario might look a little bit dystopic at the moment, there are some elements that might anticipate something very similar.
Right. I think many people would consider Donald Trump sending missiles to Iran and, claiming victory after 2 days quite dystopic, a couple of months ago, and it became true. And I think what was sort of, I would say, unexpected, because other trends are not so unlikely, I must say, is Giorgia Meloni as the council president. But then I understand that 3 years more of Donald Trump presidency can really transform EU politics as well. But before we get into the details, I wanted to dive into this challengers issue because they seem to be united, but not what they stand for, but what they are opposing. So what is that? Can you describe what those challengers are opposing within the EU?
So we chose this term, challenger, to define the 16 parties who don't sit in the current institutional European framework as we used to know it. And at the same time, not sitting them there allows them to challenge, to fight against the current European framework. Although we see that in the recent years, this kind of strong criticism towards Europe has consistently changed. Why? Because some of them in the meantime, managed to win elections, like, for example, in the case of Italy. So if in Europe they are not part of the mainstream party and framework, they have become at the national level what we can define mainstream, because they are governing. Giorgia Meloni is 2 years and a half at government. Her public support is very high. So if on one side, at the national level, they all have their own specificity, at the European level, they belong to different groups, they have different roles in national politics, and of course, because of national interest, which are political and economic, their views also differ on some specific topic. So if on one side they have managed to create a joint bloc, and Trump's second term has really strengthened this bloc, because he's really supporting these parties, and at the same time, in return, he gets a very high and public support by them, although with some differences. On the other side, they have strong also different views on topics, like, for example, Russia. For many of them, like I think about Rassemblement National, Putin, if was a good friend and a good point of reference to look at after the invasion of Ukraine, this view gradually and slowly changed. The same is President Trump itself. I mean, the tariffs issue is a big issue for member states, for our economies. And this is why some of these parties, like, for example, Vox in Spain, of course, support Trump, support MAGA. They would like to build a mega group, make Europe great again, but still they have their citizens they have to talk to, and they have to explain why the tariffs, which can be imposed by their greatest ally and strongman and point of reference on the other side, can really damage their economies. So it's a very complicated picture where each of them tries to push forward the narrative which works better to them. On the other side, trying to keep a balance vis-a-vis their national electorate.
Right. You mentioned Trump, and he seems quite central to different scenarios that you're analyzing. Do you think that if Trump really pushes his agenda of EU tariffs, and if he decides to withdraw some troops from the continent, that would be really a blow to those pro-Trump parties that you identify, which I think dominate, right? You have most of the, especially the right-wing parties, basically almost all of them are pro-Trump. It's just a question of the strength of this conviction. Do you think that could really be divisive line? Because on one hand, Trump ideologically, especially J.D. Vance, they they are aligned with those parties. They want to strengthen them. They want to support them. They're looking for partners, ideological partners in Europe, the Heritage Foundation as well. But it's hard to imagine, especially in countries such as France, which are sort of sovereignist in its outlook, that you can be united with Trump, who seems to be making this with Russia, which will be a no-go for the peace in Poland. On the other hand, is withdrawing from Europe, so it's be a big blow for the pro-NATO countries, even on the anti-establishment parties. And thirdly, he is punishing, Europe and Europeans' customers. Do you think that, because Trump is really unpredictable, but do you think that if Trump pursues such a policy, which is, I think, quite probable, do you think that it is possible that those challengers parties would have to reorient themselves, or they would rather go with Trump, whatever it takes?
No, I think that they will really need to evaluate very carefully what to do, because if Trump on one side is a big advantage to them, it's a big megaphone as well to their claims, to their ideas. On the other side, it can become a really risky factor for their national politics and for how their citizens might look at them. We need to consider that many of the countries we analyzed will soon, in 2 or 3 years, will go on elections, and many of these challengers might win those elections, and Trump can really determine the way European citizens will be looking at those leaders. So it's really a very strange phenomenon, President Trump, for these parties, because if on one side he's the great justification for many of the things they say publicly, on the other side he can become the biggest risk to them. We have seen that with security and defense. We have seen that as well with Russia, how to deal with Russia under the second Trump presidency. I mean, the way President Trump dialogued with Putin, I'm pretty sure he shocked many of our challengers. So it's very fragile. This political equilibrium at the moment is very fragile, but still, as this is one of the things that comes out from our research, because of we see a kind of frozen mainstream scenario. I mean, mainstream parties, namely those who are sitting now in EU institution, who deals with policy making at the EU level, they look a kind of frozen. And this is really advantaging a lot the challengers. This is giving the challengers time to try to build their own strategy vis-a-vis Trump and how President Trump sees the current global order. So if on one side Trump is something difficult to them as well, on the other, at the moment, they are playing all their cards quite well if we look at polls in different member states, because the mainstream parties still don't know how to react to this wave, which is increasing and increasing. At the moment, the challenger sits in the third and fourth group in the European Parliament, most of them. But what will happen in the next European election? It could be that they might be able to become the second group in the European Parliament. So European politics will really change, because then mainstream party will need the challenger parties' support if we want to push European integration forward.
Well, you mentioned this sort of frozen scenario, but for the mainstream parties, but on issues such as migration, for example, or even Green Deal, we've seen a lot of convergence recently. But also the challengers party, they really adjusted their positions on issues such as anti-Semitism or even Russia to large extent after the full-scale invasion. I wondered, to what extent do you think that the political system and the mainstream parties will adapt and therefore sort of take over some of the support that the challengers have at this moment? And to what extent do you think it is possible for the mainstream parties to take over part of the message of those challengers parties? Because I think part of their appeal is that they don't take responsibility for the past mistakes. They have basically no responsibility for the budgets. They don't have to make these tough decisions, tough calls, choosing between defense, choosing between social issues and economy. So, do you think that this is really a question of adjusting the policy and maybe being, more neutral on Russia and more pro-Trump rhetorically, or do you think that this is something deeper? That there are some cleavages which wouldn't be possible or easy to cross for the mainstream parties in pursuit of the voters currently supporting the challengers parties?
Well, the transformation process of the mainstream parties started already, I think, with the big migration crisis. We saw how those parties in Europe had quickly to adapt to the populist narrative regarding migration. For example, I think about 10 years ago, Italy, when a mainstream government, a progressive government led by the Democratic Party, signed one of the really most worrying agreements on migration with Libya, for example. We saw that a mainstream party which was afraid of losing consensus decided to make a deal with a non-democratic country to keep migrants outside Europe. We saw this also during now the recent Polish presidential electoral campaign. Migration became something on which even the progressive candidate really pushed a lot with a different language and a different narrative. So on migration, this process is already something very consolidated. We see that mainstream parties in Germany as well. Merz, during the electoral campaign, used such strong words on migration, advanced such new strong policies that no one would have ever expected from Germany. So this is something already happening. And we see that already, for example, on security and defense. The debate in member states regarding security and defense is going in the same direction of migration. Mainstream parties are really criticizing a lot the increase of investment spending in defense, and they use the challengers wording. So we are stealing this money from health, education. We see a common language which has become very mainstream and belongs to both spheres of European politics, the mainstream, and on the other side, the challengers. We could also say that the mainstream parties have been inspired by the challenger narrative adopted not only during electoral campaigns, but usually on a daily basis, a narrative which is successful, because if we look at the rise of those challengers, if compared to 2019 elections, we see something really, a phenomenon that it was really unexpected. So mainstream parties are now they really need to make a big choice, preserving their ethics in politics, their ideas, their values, or giving them up in order to keep the political power, which, however, is decreasing and decreasing. We're seeing this in many member states. In Spain, for example, with Sanchez, who is going through a very deep crisis and he's losing consensus among citizens. We see in Italy with the Democratic Party, who used to lead the country with many governments in the past years. So there is something clearly missing in the communication strategy of mainstream parties. There are some mistakes, evident mistakes. We saw that during COVID, how long it took EU mainstream institution, if we want to call them like this, to communicate better. We saw the same on Ukraine. There is something really missing, and one of the outcomes of our research is a kind of policy recommendation to the mainstreams to really understand what they want to do and how they want to grow up, because now to them is the moment to really step up and decide if they want to grow up, so preserve their ideas, values, or if they want to stay in this kind of political limbo where they are always waiting for the challengers, new claims, new attacks where they wait for international order events in order to react. So do they want to keep their agenda, or it will just be a stream of consciousness where each of the mainstream parties will try to survive?
I think it will be interesting to talk about Italy, which is sort of laboratory of how the former populist parties adapt to being in power, taking responsibility. Uh, how would you describe the evolution before Fratelli d'Italia took power, and but also the part of coalitions, of course, Lega and Forza Italia? How would you describe the main cleavages between them, but also how transformed is especially Fratelli d'Italia, but all the this right wing parties by being in power? Because I think a lot of people are using Meloni as sort of example that it's not as bad, because in the end, the populists, once they are in power, they sort of follow suit, and Meloni was very consistent in being anti-Russian, anti-Putin, even though Italy is obviously not the most anti-Russian country in Europe. She's been very transatlantic. She is not really causing huge trouble, I think, within European Union in comparison to Orban or Law and Justice before. So, how would you describe this let's say, sort of European experiment of having a major European country led by the former or still maybe currently populist or challenger party?
Yeah, we always say that here in Rome, that Italy is the perfect political laboratorium to look at if you want to anticipate European trends. We had a former comedian founding a party which then became a ruling party, namely the Five Star Movement. We saw how, Brothers of Italy is the perfect representation of how citizens, by feeling betrayed by the so-called mainstream parties, decided to give the vote to someone who started with zero 10 years ago and managed to get an amount of vote which I don't think Prime Minister Meloni expected. But even better, she has now managed to even rise in polls. So apart from having won the election, she now has a very high support, which is not decreasing. And this is perfectly reflects what is happening in Europe. You have a challenger which is very successful in the narrative, although here we need to split Meloni's narrative between the domestic one and the European international one. On the domestic policy, Meloni is very defensive, and she builds her public narrative most on the mistakes done by her predecessors. At the European level, Meloni is very cautious in criticizing Europe and Europe's mistakes. She has been very vocal on many topics. You mentioned Ukraine. No one would have ever expected Meloni to keep this line on Russia, especially having as a junior partner in the government the League and Matteo Salvini, who, on the contrary, is well known to be a strong admirer of President Putin. She was very vocal on migration. All she has done with Ursula von der Leyen in signing agreements with North African countries, the plan with Albania, it failed, but still, it was a kind of a provocative and a new idea for Europe. And what is surprising is that many member states looked at the Albania plan, sorry if I call it like this, like a very interesting case to look at. So there is this big difference, and this is working. Domestically, she's very aggressive politically. At the European level, at the international level, she's very cautious. She tries to keep a dialogue with Berlin and Paris, which are not her best friends. We should always consider that she lost, for example, Orban as her main ally because of Orban's position against Putin, which completely differs from Meloni's. She lost PIS in Poland. Her biggest friends are not her biggest ally anymore, although they remain friends, because this is what challengers also are. They might differ, but then when needed, they manage to build coalition. We saw Meloni defending Orban and Hungary veto on renewal of sanctions and on support to Ukraine, always trying to find that diplomatic language which allows her on one side to show that she's a reliable actor in Europe, but she doesn't betray her values and her friends. And this is an equilibrium game. She's also very helped by the fact that her junior partners are quite weak at the moment. The League is losing public support. Forza Italia is a kind of lost party at the moment, looking for a new leadership, looking also for financing the party. So, I mean, she is quite lucky at the moment. The Democratic Party, which is the main opposition party, is also helping her a lot because of the unclear position on Ukraine, on Russia. The party is quite split on defense and security. And then you have the Five-Star Movement, which is the best representation of how populism works, which is still divided in itself. So there are all these conditions that allows Meloni to do whatever she wants politically. And another thing, she knows very well that despite the fact that we have political instability, we are still one of the biggest economies in Europe. And this relation with Trump is for sure helping her. It did not bring to any visible success at the moment, but still in Europe, in Brussels, in other European capitals, they know that Meloni can talk to Trump, can have with Trump a dialogue which they cannot have at all. So still, this is part of her political power at the moment.
Well, I think this is a great place to end, and both Italy and Meloni is a place to watch, but also other challenges in Europe. Let's see who makes to the G7 or G8 in the 4 years' time. Teresa Coratella, thank you so much for being with us at Liberal Europe today.
Thank you so much.
This is all from me, Leszek Jazdzewski, and please tune in for Ricardo Silvestre next week. Until 2 weeks. Goodbye.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.